Good evening, everyone. Yeah, woohoo! It is so great to look out and see all of your faces. Thank you so much for coming tonight. How many of you are visiting the Center for Fiction for the first time? Oh, a bunch of you. So, if you don't know much about us, we're the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we do that in a lot of different ways, and there are like brochures and things laying around. So please check those out and learn a little bit more about us. And please come back and see us because we do a lot of events here. And I love to be the channel of connecting you with your authors that you either know and love or that you're discovering. What else can I tell you? A few housekeeping announcements. We will have an audience Q&A tonight, and if you're here, just raise your hand, and one of our fabulous interns will bring a microphone to you. That's so that the people who are joining us via YouTube can also hear the question. So please wait for the microphone. Also, hello to those of you who are joining us on YouTube. We're happy that you're joining us too. And if you have questions, you may type them into the chat at any point. And before we round out the audience Q&A, we'll throw in a question or two of yours. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our wonderful guest this evening. Barbara Kingsolver is the author of 10 best-selling works of fiction, including the novels Unsheltered, Flight Behavior, The Lacuna, The Poisonwood Bible, Animal Dreams, and The Bean Trees, as well as books of poetry, essays, and creative nonfiction. Her work of narrative nonfiction is the influential bestseller Animal Vegetable Miracle, A Year of Food Life. Kingsolver's work has been translated into more than 20 languages and has earned literary awards and a devoted readership at home and abroad. She was awarded the National Humanities Medal, our country's highest honor for service through the arts, as well as a Dayton Literary Peace Prize for the body of her work. She lives with her family on a farm in southern Appalachia, which is the right way to say it, by the way, it's Appalachia. And joining her tonight is Silas House. He's a New York Times bestselling author of 7 novels, 1 book of creative nonfiction, and 3 plays. His writing has appeared in The Atlantic, The Advocate, Time, Garden and Gun, The New York Times, and elsewhere. A former commentator for NPR's All Things Considered. I swear you can listen to this man talk for days. He is also an executive producer and one of the subjects of the Hulu film Hillbilly, the winner of the Media Award from the Foreign Press Association with other honors. He is the winner of the Nautilus Award, the Storylines Prize from the NAV New York Public Library, the Appalachian Book of the Year, and an E.B. White honor, among many others. I absolutely love both of their novels, and I know you will too. Please welcome them to the stage.
I have a voice. Okay.
Well, thank you all for being here. Can you hear me? Yes. Sound good? We're so happy to be here. It's just such a beautiful, amazing space to be in. And this is actually Barbara's first stop on, the book was just released today. So congratulations. I've been on book tour almost 3 weeks now, so I'm a little discombobulated, but it really helps to be amongst friends, and especially to be with Barbara, who has been with me on this book since before it was a book, when it was just an idea.
Right, and likewise right. You with mine, so,
yeah.
Which will be a really fun thing to talk about if you all want to hear.
Yeah, one of the things we were going to talk about is that we traded manuscripts in advance and sort of, I don't think that gets talked to. Often we'll say we had readers, but we don't really ever are on stage with the readers.
Early, very first drafts, do you think this is an okay book? Do you think this is going to work? And yeah, so, right. So.
And so I guess to start off, I would like to just talk a little bit about your book and what I love about it, As you probably know, it is a loose, kind of contemporary retelling of David Copperfield. Kingsolver could make that its own entity, and Demon is just he's a narrator that you never forget, and it's one of those books to me that's so rooted in the narrative voice. And I'm always thinking, when I think about the book, I always am thinking about him. And like I said to you this morning, I'm just so glad Demon is out in the world, because you write the book and then it's sort of, you feel like your characters are stuck in a little box for a while.
Yeah.
And then they finally get released into the world and you get to talk about them.
Yeah.
But I think this is the great Appalachian novel, It's taken all those things that people understand and misunderstand about Appalachia and articulating that really abstract notion, right? To me, writing a novel is always about an abstract notion that I'm trying to wrangle.
Mm-hmm. And it gets bigger
Right.
and bigger and bigger as you write, and so we're trying to rein it in.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it deals with the opioid crisis. But for me, the thing that I love so much about this book is the relationships, and the way people interact. And I think when we are on the road and we're doing interviews and stuff, we tend to have to talk a lot about like the opioid crisis.
The content,
right.
yeah, because of the news cycle.
Yes.
Because like journalists want to hang it on content, like climate change or the opioid crisis. So yeah, it is interesting, and it's a kind of a hazard for. Well, we're just jumping right in here. It's kind of a hazard for a novelist that you get identified with your content. So you're like the go-to girl on whatever on Africa, or you're the you're the hillbilly that we call them. And so yeah, we end up talking about the content and not about what we spent years and years thinking about at our desks, which was the sentences, the voice,
the characters.
the characters, the relate. Anyway, well, thank you for that beautiful introduction.
So do you want to read a little bit to give them a little bit of that voice?
Real little piece, to give you a little piece of that voice, and then we'll talk about Lark Ascending. Clearly, this is my first night of my first book tour. I have to get the sticky notes in place. All right, this is chapter 1. We'll just start at the beginning. First, I got myself born. A decent crowd was on hand to watch, and they've always given me that much. The worst of the job was up to me, my mother being, let's just say, out of it. On any other day, they'd have seen her outside on the deck of her trailer home, good neighbors taking notice, pestering the tit of trouble as they will. All through the dog breath air of late summer and fall, cast an eye up the mountain, and there she'd be, little bleach blonde, smoking her Pall Malls, hanging on that railing like she's captain of her ship up there, and now might be the hour it's going down. This is an 18-year-old girl we're discussing, all on her own and as pregnant as it gets. The day she failed to show, it fell to Nance Peggott to go bang on the door, barge inside, and find her passed out on the bathroom floor with her junk all over the place and me already coming out. A slick, fish-colored hostage picking up grit from the vinyl tile, worming and shoving around because I'm still inside the sack that babies float in pre-real life. Mr. Peggott was outside, idling his truck, headed for evening service, probably thinking about how much of his life he'd spent waiting on women. His wife would have told him the Jesusing could hold on a minute. First, she needed to go see if the little pregnant gal had got herself liquored up again. Mrs. Peggott being a lady that doesn't beat around the bushes, and if need be, will tell Christ Jesus to sit tight and keep his pretty hair on. She came back out yelling for him to call 911 because a poor child is in the bathroom trying to punch himself out of a bag. Like a little blue prize fighter. Those are the words she'd use later on, being not at all shy to discuss the worst day of my mom's life. And if that's how I came across to the first people that laid eyes on me, I'll take it. To me, that says I had a fighting chance. Long odds, yes, I know. If a mother is lying in her own piss and pill bottles while they're slapping the kid she's shunted out, telling him to look alive, likely the bastard is doomed. Kid born to the junkie is a junkie. He'll grow up to be everything you don't want to know. The rotten teeth and dead zone eyes, the nuisance of locking up your tools in the garage so they don't walk off. The rent by the week motel squatting well back from the scenic highway. This kid, if he wanted a shot at the finer things, should have got himself delivered to some rich or smart or Christian non-using type of mother. Anybody will tell you the born of this world are marked from the get-out, win or lose. Me, though, I was a born sucker for the superhero rescue. Did that line of work even exist in our trailer home universe? Had they all quit Smallville and gone looking for the bigger action? Save or be saved? These are questions. You want to think it's not over till the last page.
So that's one of the things about the book, right? Is you take a character like Demon's mother, who's just so often reduced to a pillhead, right? She's just worthless in the eyes of so many people, and she's such an endearing character in the book. You know, you just. She's not a saint.
She's doing the best she can with what
right.
with the deal she got.
She's a fully complex human being.
Well, thank you.
And you care so deeply about her. I mean, she just breaks your heart over and over again as a reader, but often in a good way, if that makes sense. You know.
Yeah. Well, and now it's time to talk about your book.
Okay.
Now hush. And before we do, I just want to say this is a dream come true for a couple of reasons. One is it might be the first time in history that a stage in Brooklyn was dominated by Kentuckians. And Silas and I have spent so many hours talking about books, like talking about writing and books on either on my porch or in y'all's living room with a bottle of bourbon on the table, and it's just so comfortable and wonderful, and we appreciate the host of this event letting us bring this fun conversation.
Feels kind of like
to
we're on
this
the porch.
place. Yeah, y'all come on up. And I'm just thrilled and excited to have seen this book grow from an embryo into the beautiful book it is. It might be my favorite of Silas's novels, and that's saying a lot because I think every time I read one I say this is my favorite. But it is different. It's different in scope. It takes place between continents, between North America and Ireland, and it's large in its sort of its thematic scope. It's a journey. It's a survivor's tale, I guess you would say, and it's about climate refugees set in a future that's just uncomfortably too close to bear almost, but it has become impossible for these characters to stay in North America, and they're escaping both social and climate terror. And the narrator, Lark, which is a beautiful name, we talked a lot about that, ends up mainly walking across Ireland with a dog. And I love that dog. Everybody loves that dog. Yeah. But the relationship between the dog and the man, and the young man, is a beautiful part of the story. And the way, and all the relationships, the people he meets along the way and loses along the way, really add up to a a story of great grief, and of processing of grief, which is something I think that we're all doing right now, sort of faster and almost the losses are coming at us so fast. It's hard to slow down and really give the time and the emotional energy to grieving the burning earth, the lost civil liberties, so many things. So it's enormously ambitious because I feel like it's a book that really asks the reader to go on that journey of processing grief, and makes it a beautiful journey that you want to go on. I guess both of us took really highly unmarketable subjects and did our best to bring you along on these journeys, because we feel like it's work that we're all doing, and part of a writer's job is to sort of reach out and like from our heart to yours and say, yes, this is real, and we will let's go on this journey. So why don't you read a little bit?
I'm going to read just a little scene where Lark meets Seamus, who's a beagle, for the first time. And for complicated reasons, their dogs have basically been outlawed, and in this dystopian sort of time. And Seamus may be the last dog in Ireland, and he has survived because he's learned how to be quiet and to hide, which is pretty incredible because he's a beagle. And so I just so happen to have a beagle who's pretty quiet, as beagles go. And so
in your actual life, a real beagle.
Right,
yeah,
right. Yeah, and
he's a sweet beagle.
yes. We'll talk more about him later because I have a story about Barbara and the beagle. But so here's a little scene where he has just seen the dog hiding in the woods. I waited. I was so tired I could barely move, but somehow I thought if the dog might come near and put his wet nose into the palm of my hand, I would be re-energized. This one act would be enough to get me through. And so, this was the first time he saved me. The dog had come forward, but now he hesitated, took one step back, his brown eyes locked onto my face, trying to read any sign that might be found there. "It's okay, buddy," I said, and I realized that even my lips were tired. Even the muscles in my face were tired. I felt slack-jawed, like weights had been attached to my pant legs and the hem of my shirt. The rain was falling quiet and soft, like small feet stamping the leaves, but I knew that any minute the sky would open up. The sound of thunder was shifting closer and louder. "Please," I said to the dog. I did not want to be alone anymore. And so he came forward, close enough for me to pet him. There were small twigs and cockleburs caught in his fur, but his coat was somehow clean and smooth, as if he had been careful to bathe and groom himself on his journey. I leaned close, and he startled me with a lick to the nose. Then I could see he was wearing a red collar. I took hold of it, and there was a small, round silver medallion hanging from it that read, "Seamus." I whispered the dog's name, only knowing how to pronounce it because my father had loved Seamus Haney so much. I caught sight of my father, back on the mountain in Maine, standing before the high flames of our fire, one hand floating out in front of him like a bird, the other a hold of his belt buckle as he called out the final line of a poem. Death would be like a night spent in the wood. At the end, he put his hands together and looked briefly skyward to give credit. "Seamus Haney, ladies and gentlemen," he'd said. Then he bowed as we all clapped. I took the dog's ears in each hand and felt them in my palms, smooth down his neck and along his back. "Good, Seamus," I said. He was looking at me as if he had been craving such a massage for a long while. Seamus's eyes had sorrow in them. This old boy knew what deep loss was, just as I did. Two creatures can always tell that about one another. And so when I was working on the book, well, first of all, I had gone to Ireland right after the passing of my aunt, who was a second mother to me. She was one of my parents, even though she was my aunt. And I had to go to Ireland the day after her funeral, and I was just, I was undone in sorrow. And so I sort of floated through my responsibilities in Ireland. I had been asked to be a visiting writer at the National University of Ireland at Galway. And luckily, my husband was able to go and steered me through things. And so I did a lot of walking on my own when I was in Ireland to try to process all the grief I was going through. And at one point, a little sheepdog followed me for like 2 miles. And it was as if he appeared just when I needed him most, and I spent some time with him. So when I started writing the book, I was adamant that this would be a sheepdog in the book. And so Barbara has a border collie, and I was just grilling her all the time with questions about her dog, the most minute details of
What do they follow? Do they track with their eyes? What do their ears do? All these really
just
questions.
everything. And finally, with great patience, Barbara said, you have a perfectly good beagle at your disposal. And so I called a friend of mine who's from Ireland, and I said, how familiar are you, as an Irish person, with beagles? And she said, we had loads of beagles around all the time. And so Barbara and my friend Audrey gave me permission to use my beagle, and it just made the book, so much better. Because I was able to study him, and some of the book is told from his point of view, so it's really important that I get it right.
Yeah. Well, it's it goes back to what what we tell students, what we learned as that we have to learn over and over again. Write what you know.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that you can't just write what you know. I mean, if I only wrote about my life, it just would be so boring.
Canning.
Oh, Lord, canning. Yeah, pulling weeds. But no, I mean, our job is to invent lives much more interesting than ours, and also to make everything come out, like means. It's about meaning, really. You find meaning. But ultimately, what that means, right? What you know is get the details right. Because a novel is made of details, and a lie in fiction is just boring. It just doesn't work. So you can make it a dystopian beagle. You can set it in another country, but it still has to be a beagle. And you did it beautifully. And one of the it was so much. It was so much fun. One of the fun things that writer friends do is we share ideas very early, much earlier than we do with our editors. Sorry. I remember first hearing, or probably reading in an email, what are you doing? What are you working on? What are you thinking about? I'm writing this novel, or I'm thinking about this novel about this boy that walks across Ireland. And I said, well, what's he looking, why is he walking across Ireland? And as I recall, you said, well, I'm still working on that part. like the beginning and the end, but that's what we do. We take it, we start with this sort of lump of clay that has emotional meaning for us, and then we invest it with plot that sort of, that really will reveal the theme. And it was really interesting to work that out. And I think I also remember I told you, okay, well, I'm just doing the craziest thing. I had told you that for years I was trying to figure out how to write about the opioid epidemic, which is just really, nobody really wants to hear about that. And specifically the orphans, the kids that have been orphaned. And it just, woe is me, how can I do this? It's just such a miserable, dark topic. And then I said, this is a crazy idea. What do you think of taking David Copperfield, because that's marketable. Charles Dickens, he knew orphans, that was his shtick. But he also, he wrote these novels that had people lined up, they were released in serial form, like a chapter, like a chunk at a time, and people were waiting at the docks for these to be delivered off the ships. They couldn't wait for the next chapter. So I thought, if I can have me some of that, get me some of Dickens. And then I just said, well, what if I just made this kid Copperhead? Make him an Appalachian David Copperfield. I do remember this. We were sitting on my back patio, and I said, well, I would call it Copperhead, but there's already a novel had just that year been published called Copperhead, and I couldn't do that. And you said, well, call him David Copperhead, and it was like permission. And I said, well, okay, I'll think about that. And then he became Demon Copperhead. But it's like a lot of this was a lot of what writer friends do for each other is permission. Yeah, go for it. Be brave.
And it holds you accountable somehow, too, when you speak it to a writer friend. But at the same time, with a trusted writer friend, you know that they'll be okay if you change course, and they'll support you. And, know, so it's for me, it's a really rare thing to have a writer friend that I really trust with that sort of information. You have to carefully curate who that is.
You do, and also there's also honesty. We don't just say, "Oh, that sounds great," right. Everything. Let me think. What did we tell each other? What did we correct each other on?
Well, I had a hummingbird in Ireland, and you caught that right away.
Yeah, that can't happen.
And you really challenged me on the world building, which was the hardest part for me, because I've always written books that are rooted in reality. I've never created a sort of alternate reality, a world in the future. And so I was so glad that you held me to task on that and really called out the things that felt right and didn't feel right, and that allowed me to hone it and polish it and prune it, in a way that made it such a better novel.
But I was also wrong I remember saying, because remember, it's hard to remember. Like this was, a while ago, a year and a half ago or something. I was saying it's hard to imagine a world where people are persecuted for, where civil liberties have been taken away, because people just don't go backwards. Like once people have the right to abortion, that's not going to go away. Okay, I was really wrong about that.
Well, and
you were prescient in a way that I just missed somehow, just too optimistic.
But also the world was changing the whole time I was editing and revising and unfortunately.
Yeah.
Right.
Unfortunately.
Yeah, I've said that several times on this book tour that people who can carry children have less rights now than they did when I sold the book. Right. So it sort of makes the book more relevant in lots of ways.
It does, yeah. Conveniently, the world got worse for the benefit of your novel.
Yeah. It's not that I wanted that to happen, but it's better for the book. I don't know, what did I catch in?
Oh, language. Because, I've been out of Kentucky a while, or I was out of Kentucky a while. Now I live in Southwest Virginia, which is culturally very, very exactly like the culture I grew up in. It's really Southwest Virginia, East Tennessee, Eastern Kentucky they should be a separate state because culturally they are, and they used to be. It was the state of Franklin at one time. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it got divvied up in some poker game, I guess. But I have lived outside of the region. I became a code shifter so that I talk like this when I'm on TV. And then
it's impossible for me. My mouth just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's and see, I admire that you haven't given up your voice at all. But I did, maybe partly as an insecure young woman.
You still just said I did.
Well, I know because I'm talking to you. But no, when I went to college, in Indiana, people I didn't know would stop me on the sidewalk and say, say mayonnaise, say syrup,
Right.
these words. It just got mocked out of me, and I just gradually became a code shifter. And then also my spouse is not Kentuckian, not from the region, and so it's sort of what you just somehow what you hear you absorb. And so of course when I'm talking to my neighbors, I this is my language.
Yeah.
But when I'm talking
Home
to
language.
home language. But anyway, it was very valuable to me that you vetted my language, and there were things like what I remember in particular is I had sneakers. The kids wore sneakers.
I was appalled at that one.
Appalled? That's appalling. We did not ever say sneakers growing up. I never heard that word until it was probably in my 20s. We said tennis shoes, and we still say tennis shoes, which is ironic because there was not a tennis court in my county. But we say tennis shoes.
Right.
So, yeah. So, just a lot of little things like that. Branch instead of creek. I don't know. Just a lot of words. And also, I mean, you were very helpful in directing voice, language, just giving. Yeah, it was great.
One thing I remember early on is that you were a little worried about how blue his language was. He cusses a lot.
F-bombs
and I'm like,
all over.
It never felt gratuitous in any way to me. So I was encouraging it.
He's to blame. Yeah. Well, I guess you teach and you're around students and you know how young people talk. I mean, and I'm around young people too. But I guess I needed permission. But
I know how I talk too. So.
Right. But yeah, I did ultimately rein him in a little. But I think I remember I got to page 200, and I thought, I'll just do a search to see how many times the F word has been used. 175.
Wow. It's like a Scorsese film.
Yeah, so I thought, well, let's just set a goal here. Let's dial it back to 100, like one every other page. But it's authentic. I mean, and it's not just that he's saying that word, but another thing I remember about language was I was very nervous about just full-on, just giving
Vernacular.
Demon this full-on vernacular because I have been so conditioned to the fact that the minute you say I reckon, the minute you say holler, you are typecast.
Yeah.
And I was afraid that people, like on page 1, if people read holler, they'd say, oh, this is, whatever, coal miner's daughter, whatever.
Right.
And I was afraid of that. And I was also, I don't know, what should I say, embarrassed that I was afraid of that. It was a conflict for me. And so my compromise was I ease you in gradually. So I didn't say holler until maybe page 5 or, just kind of invite you into the vernacular and then just build it up.
Yeah. There's so much psychology involved in writing, I think. I think about that all the time.
It's all we're manipulating
Right.
you. We are.
Yeah.
And another thing I remember we talked a lot about was representing Seamus from a beagle's point of view, because it's very hard to do. But I had done it once in Prodigal Summer. Prodigal Summer opens and closes from a coyote's point of view. So I had thought a whole lot about how do you do that and make it not ridiculous or not hokey. And there were a couple things I remember telling you that because I had thought it through. The advice I gave, I think, was if it's a dog, he's seeing with his nose, right? I mean, what else do you remember what else?
Well, that in particular just changed the whole book, And so I took it a step further in that. I thought if I'm going to write from the dog's point of view and really, focus on the olfactory, then I should do that with the human too. And so Lark is constantly thinking about scent as well. Like the smell of cedar, is the way he carries his lost love with him, who was obsessed with cedar trees. And, so I think it just adds so much. It made so much sense when you said it. I mean, of course, and it really just totally changed the book. So, I can't thank you enough. for that.
Well, but you did by writing a wonderful book. But I just, I love this dog, and it's so, we are such human-centric, we're just, we spend all of our time thinking about one species. And it's, I think, so valuable to get a reader, since a novel does this amazing magic trick of putting you, the reader, into the brain of another being, which no other art form can do that. That's like that's our superpower.
Right.
We get to do that for
Yes.
you. So why not, although it's almost never done, rarely done successfully, but try putting the reader into the mind of another species. And I can think of a few cases. Well, they'll come to me. There was a book told from the point of view of elephants. I should have, see if I can
don't
look up
know
my
that one.
phone. I'll think of it directly. But it was beautifully done. But it's people rarely try it
Yeah.
because it is risky.
Right. Yeah, it's a real challenge.
White Bone, that's the
I
name.
don't know
Yeah,
that
Barbara
one.
Gowdy, White Bone. I really recommend it. It's told entirely from the point of view of elephants, and elephants are really smart and emotionally rich. And so that was something I went to when I was working on
Yeah.
coyotes. But anyway.
Well, I wanted to ask about, it's such a wonderful premise, to write your retelling of David Copperfield, but what about the pressure of that too? Like, Dickens. And you told this wonderful story in the Times interview that most of you probably read, where you had a conversation with Dickens about this, right?
I did, and it's not something I do much, but yeah. Long story short, I was a couple years into this real anguish about how can I tell this story about these these opioid orphans in Appalachia, and I was just on a whim at the end of a UK book tour. I booked myself into this creaky old mansion, which was the former home of Charles Dickens, where he wrote David Copperfield, and Stephen had flown over, and we booked ourselves in, and there was nobody else there, and they said, just make yourselves at home. And so they just gave us the run of the place, and it was Charles Dickens's house, and his study was there with his desk, and I just gravitated toward that desk, and I put my head on that desk, and it was like Charles Dickens' stuff. Yeah, it was all around, things hanging on the wall. It was really, he was very present there, and I just felt his anger or his outrage. That really was his. This was his passion project, to tell the polite Victorians, all is not okay with the kids. You're throwing away these kids, and it's bad. So I just felt like he was saying, you have to do this. But, and I could swear I heard his voice. He said, you let the child tell the story. Point of view is everything. Let the child tell the story, because that's how people will listen. That's how people will feel compelled to believe. And that's when I got the idea. Just, okay, David Copperfield, chapter 1, I am born. And I started that. Well, first I ran and woke up Stephen, and he was, sleeping in Charles Dickens's bed. And I said, I just talked to Charles Dickens. And he said, Stephen, this is true.
It's a Stephen response.
He said, I can't wait to hear about it in the morning. And so then I went back, and I just started writing. And so I don't know, this is perhaps a ridiculous thing to say, but I felt I had permission to do this. And A, and B, he's dead.
Right. You don't need permission.
But it just somehow or other, it just clicked. I suppose if it hadn't worked, I wouldn't have, if I kept, running up against something impossible, I would have abandoned the project. But I just decided chapter and verse. I just opened an Excel file with 66 chapters and put in each chapter what happens in David Copperfield, and then wrote my version of what's going to happen to Demon Copperhead, and then just started working through it. And it turned into a kind of a fun, almost a game. Like, what's the modern equivalent of a shoe black factory? I know, a gas and go with a meth lab in the back. Just kind of working it out became it was like this, this fun challenge. Oops,
It's my chair.
Oh, okay. But also, because I had, I really felt Dickens at my elbow, it was a masterclass in plot. I really, by paying such close attention, I really saw the mechanics of, okay, he has these short chapters that pull you in. Like you're reading and you're about to go to sleep and you say, "This is just 6 more pages, I can read this." And then at the page 5.5, there's this little twist. And so you're like, okay, one
now
more
you gotta
chapter.
read it,
So that, just these little tricks of his plotting, and also the coincidences, like how there's almost a cadence of how often he brings unexpected characters together. So I learned a lot.
Yeah. Well, it's not quite the same thing, but this book was very inspired by Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. I really wanted, I thought of the book, even though it's set in the future, I kept thinking of it as an adventure story. It keeps getting called a speculative fiction, cli-fi, dystopian, and I'm fine with that. But I never
read
thought
like
of it
that.
Yeah.
It reads like Robert Louis Stevenson.
Right. I wanted it to have that sort of timeless narrative voice, and so I looked a lot to those old time adventure stories, and instead of looking to speculative books,
That's not really
Right.
your thing.
No,
That's not what you do.
no.
Yeah.
I mean, I read those books, but when I do it, I'm not choosing them because they're speculative. I'm choosing them because, I don't know, like Station 11, for instance. I love that book because it's about art. It's about that art must survive. That's what I love about it. Not that it's set in the future, where it's speculative. And I love it for its language, things like that. So it's interesting that, you have to have these labels, but at the same time, I think often we're labeling them very differently.
Well, yes, and those labels are reductive, and also I guess they're done for sales or whatever. I mean, those other people that do this stuff for us, like sell our books, have to, and have to know where to shelve it and stuff. But no, it really felt, as you say, old-fashioned. I mean, it was a very, the voice from the very beginning of Lark Ascending the tone is sort of 19th century and legendary. I'm going to tell you this story.
Right. I wanted it be a storyteller.
Yeah, and it feels like, and so, when you first
like I Am Born.
Yeah, and because, when I read it, it didn't have a jacket or, this is a story of, it just was, was it manuscript pages or was it
it was
email? Yeah, I think it was paper.
And you're just gathering information as you go.
Right, so I have no preconceptions, which is how you want a reader to read.
Yes.
And so I thought, oh, how interesting. We're both setting, we're both telling these sort of old-timey stories, even though, different in voice. But I thought I was reading something set long, long ago.
Right.
And then, several pages in, and they're talking about the music they listen to, and then there's Adele.
Yeah.
And there's
from the old days, yeah.
Yes, my mother knew this song, from the old days, and it was Adele. And and then little by, I loved that, how you just very gradually let me know I'm reading, something that's happening in the future. And I guess in a way, you did what I did by waiting till page 5 or 6 to use I reckon and holler. You didn't, easing you in, because if you don't happen to like, dystopian fiction, you're not going to be put off on the first page. So that was really good clever manipulation.
Well, I think we're about out of time.
Oh,
but
shoot.
if we're not, you used pop culture references in Demon too, and I love the way you did that. And you're sort of allowing us to gather that information to figure out the time period as well. So
Well, you can't write about
talk a little bit
teenagers
about that?
without,
right, exactly.
without popular culture.
Right.
But one interesting challenge to that is when you're writing about teenagers, they have their own language. Anyone who's been around them knows.
It's so hard to do.
Well, and it changes
So quickly.
week to week. Words that that's current now is going to be old-fashioned in at least next year. So that's a risk. I mean, in some sense, the time there's 1996 is an important year in this book because that is literally the year that
It's
OxyContin.
historical fiction now.
Yeah, it's historical fiction already. That is the year that OxyContin was rolled into Lee County, Virginia, in the area where I live, and everything changed. And it was, and that I wanted to write about that, how that was done to us very deliberately, and how devastating it was for people of all ages. So, it was, it was important to me that it be timed to some extent, but these kids, these teenagers who are named things like Maggot, his best friend is named Maggot.
I love him.
But they had to talk like teenagers, but I didn't want to lock them into a particular jargon that would quickly sound old-fashioned. And then I happened to hear on the radio, isn't it funny how when you're writing a novel, you just become this sponge.
Yep.
Everything you
antenna
see, everything you eat, everything you hear on the radio somehow just goes down this funnel into you're using it. I heard this interview about West Side Story, and the writer of the book. And the interviewer was saying, he was talking about exactly this problem in West Side Story. If the kids used their own, jargon, it would just, we wouldn't even understand it now. And the writer of the book said, well, I invented a teenage language that sounded like teenage language, but it was new. And I said, that's what I do. And so I because Demon in some ways is speaking a vernacular that's not familiar to most readers, it seemed not that much of a reach to give him his own kind of real specialized way of talking that sounds like what teenagers would say.
For me, that sort of antenna moment, the big one with this book is I'm writing this, odyssey about this young man named Lark, and for the first time in my life, I hear the piece of classical, 14-minute, one-movement classical piece, The Lark Ascending by Ralph Vaughan Williams, a completely transcendent piece of music. I hope everybody will listen to it if you don't know it. And I thought that's the soundtrack for the book, and so now I've listened to it thousands of times while I was writing the book, and I'm still moved by it, which is such a testament to the piece of music.
Yeah.
I think we should take questions, though. We have about 12 minutes left, right?
Okay.
Am I correct?
I think
Yeah.
no, you are right.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say one more thing, about music and Lark Ascending, is that it's clear that you're a lover of music and that you're a really thoughtful consumer of music, and I mean that's something that I know about you, but it also comes through in the book because music in so many ways is important to it's threaded all the way through.
It's saving them too.
Yeah.
My whole life, the things that have saved me, the natural world, dogs, music, books. And
They're
so
all there.
I wrote what I knew.
Yeah.
You write what you know, and that's in a time when the world is ending, that's what saves Lark. Yeah. Do we have questions?
You can just raise your hand and we'll come over to you with a microphone.
Thank you. Hi. David Copperfield's my favorite book, and you're my wife's favorite author, so thank you for writing this. It's going to be a battle on the car ride home over who gets to read it
This marriage
first.
can be saved.
So I appreciate the detail on how you broke down the book and then kind of, rewrote each chapter. did you kind of include the characters from Copperfield in your book?
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely, and that was one of the most fun things. I mean, there is almost a one-to-one correspondence. There, I invented a few. I did a few modifications, but for the most part, every important character. And it was so fun to rename them. So the narcissistic, dangerous friend Steerforth becomes a high school football star named Fast Forward. And it's helpful that and where we live, everybody has a nickname. That's just like in the obituary, especially men. It's more men than women. But you read the obituaries and it's Emmett Stubby Smith.
Yeah.
Like people, because they have to put it in the obituary because everybody knows him as Stubby or
especially
Shorty.
politicians all have.
Yeah, right.
So.
Well, they started out as regular people and then they became, Senator Stubby. But so that was really fun. And the real stumper was Uriah Heep. I thought, okay, what's an Appalachian Uriah Heep? Well, Piles is a common enough name, so Heep is a pile. So then he's the guy who hauls stuff around, so he became U-Haul Piles. But yeah, the function of Uriah Heep in the novel is the function. I mean, I felt often like I was stealing. Like, is this legal? There really is it's a very close retelling of David Copperfield, and it was so much fun because the hardest part of a novel by far is the first draft, is the plot. Mm-hmm. I felt like I had, and I've said many times, I wish I could pay somebody to write my first draft, just farm it out. Because the revision is the fun part. Well, I farmed out my first draft, and let me tell you, if you're going to outsource your plot, Dickens is your man. So yeah, I mean, if you don't have to, you absolutely don't have to read David Copperfield to read this book. It completely stands on its own. But if you do read Demon Copperhead and then you read Dickens,
it's even richer. Yeah.
You're just going to laugh at all the private jokes between me and Charles. Demon's copyright ran out a long time ago. And, as I mentioned, he's dead.
This is a question about your dog, but I'm just wondering if, through observing your dog so closely, if you learned anything surprising that made you maybe change the way you looked at your dog.
The question was, by observing the dog, was there anything surprising that I found in studying him? Well, I think, we tend to project human qualities onto animals, and so I think studying him really closely, I had to really try to not do that. And that was really hard to do, to not make assumptions from the human point of view about what he was thinking or right. Yeah. And so that was probably the biggest challenge of writing the dog. And I mean, not to be too precious, but I think just observing him so closely just deepened my love for animals. And the past few years has deepened my love for animals because I have gone to them so often for solace. I think it's been a part of what this book is about. It has been a very sad time for years now. And for me, writing this book was working through all that sadness. We not only have personal griefs, we have these global sorts of griefs, witnessing climate disaster and school shootings and police brutality, and I mean the list just goes on and on. And so one of the main ways I have gotten through that is by turning to the dog, and hanging on to him. And I became just so much more deeply attached. I say all the time to him, I love you way too much.
Because that's the saddest thing. We're going to outlive our dog.
Exactly. It's unavoidable. Yeah. I mean, yeah. For the most part.
For the
yeah.
most part. I mean, it's supposed
Dogs
to go
don't live long enough.
Right,
That's
right,
what we're trying to
yeah,
say.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I'm curious about whether, since David Copperfield was written about 150 years ago or however long ago, was there anything that was hard to find the modern equivalent of? Were there moments that you thought, oh, the world has changed so much that there's actually nothing I can do in this particular chapter?
I'm pretty creative, you know. I mean, they tell me. No, I mean, there were some things that were obviously going to change. Like David Copperfield becomes a famous writer. You know, that's his trajectory. And I knew this kid, this junkies kid from Lee County was not going to be a famous writer. So I had to, but it was important that he have some creative passion and aptitude that would be, because that's an important part of that novel and of my novel, is how art can save us. And that this kid, so he becomes a cartoonist, and he becomes he loves like drawing superheroes. So then he becomes, like his friends say, draw me a comic of this, and his Aunt Jane, who's a nurse, he draws her as Wonder Woman nurse with what he calls the bra outfit. And so, things, I mean, I just really tried hard to find. There were a few things, like there's a whole part of David Copperfield where David becomes something like a lawyer who, I don't even know, I couldn't even understand it's like another kind of lawyer that does something, and I couldn't understand what it was, so I just jettisoned that. That was just, I mean, I felt free to ignore things that made no sense. But in the main, I would say the main thing that I had to change was that David Copperfield is very naive, sort of trusting. Oh, my mother has married this new fellow Murdstone. I'll give him a chance. And Demon is like, screw that.
Yeah.
This guy is no good. He's a modern kid. He's much more cynical. He has to be living in this time and place. So yeah, there's some profound departures of attitude, but I just felt like, I mean, it was the story that I need. The rollicking good tale that was of use to me. And so I kept that.
We're going to take one more in-person question, and then we'll do a question from our YouTube audience.
I want to ask Silas, I don't want to put you on the spot, but as a queer writer from Appalachia, what do you, and as a successful one who has started to put queer voices in your stories, what do you see as you're talking about marketability, and I know with regional literature, all those things can mess up selling a book, but all of that aside, what do you see as the viability right now of queer voices in Appalachia? How are you going to go on that topic? Yeah.
So the question is about queer voices, especially being a queer Appalachian voice. Well, the quickest way I can answer that is just to say that I think, there are people, I have had people say to me, but there are not gay people in Appalachia, and I'm like, well, here I am.
Hello.
I don't know what to tell you, yeah. And so I think it makes it even more important to put that in literature. This is my first novel that features a gay protagonist. I've got lots of plays and short stories and other forms, but this is the first novel where it worked, where it totally served the story, and it's the book that came to me.
And I'll interject, he wasn't at the first draft. He was.
Right.
He changed.
Yes.
He transitioned.
Yeah, yes. It became more. It just the story. It started serving the story, right? Mm-hmm. For him to be a gay character in the climate that he was living in, and so then this young man sort of swam up that struck his interest, but. I think for me, it has to serve the story, and I wanted to write a book that hopefully a lot of people, this will be the first book they've read that has a gay protagonist, because it's not necessarily, this is hard to articulate, but it's not necessarily a gay book, you know? It's a book that's about lots of different things, and you know, he's very multifaceted, and the main driving force is not, you know, a queer story, but he's a queer main character. And so I like that idea of not preaching to the choir in that way.
And
you know?
also not having the burden of representation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one part of who he is.
Yeah, as all characters need to be. He's very complex, and he happens to be gay. But I think it was really interesting that the story worked perfectly well when he wasn't gay, and that.
But it made him better.
But it made him. It gave him another grief.
Exactly.
And more.
Yes.
Yeah,
and the love, you know, the love story for me was so much more visceral, because I got to write this really tender gay love story that I've always wanted to write, you know. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
And our final question for both authors. You talked about the importance of writer friends. Could you talk about what kind of influence fellow Kentuckian Wendell Berry was on you and your writing? This is from Tess.
You go ahead.
Oh, wow. Well, Wendell Berry is a friend to both of us. A mentor, both, you know, actively and passively. I mean, I for me, I guess the simplest way to put it is, growing up Appalachian, you just accept invisibility. We do not show up in mainstream, you know, movies, television, except as a goofy stereotype, which, you know, we don't identify with that. We don't even, I mean, kids don't even realize that the Beverly Hillbillies is supposed to be us, because it's just so stupid. You know, we're not offended. They're just like, they might as well be Martians. So we just grow accustomed to not seeing ourselves, not reading ourselves. And for me, it was so important when I left Kentucky and I changed the way I talked, and I tried to create a new identity for myself that was more, you know, like worldly, i.e. not Kentuckian. And I had no voice. My writing was horrible, just really horrible, because I had no voice. And it took me, I had to leave and try writing, you know, like 100 horrible short stories, and trying on different identities and voices before I started coming home and realizing, holy cow. The first actually was Bobby Ann Mason. I just read this whole book, Shiloh and Other Stories, and said, oh man, they're all Kentuckian, and it's okay to be a writer who sounds like me. And I would say the main thing Wendell Berry did for me was anchor that voice, and that not just Kentuckian, but small town, which also doesn't, you know, doesn't appear in our mainstream entertainment media. So and he's just this gentle father to us all. And, you know, he's also of an older generation, and they're, you know, we have our differences, but I don't know, he's just, yeah, he's like the godfather of Kentucky writers.
Yeah, and for me, it's a big part of Wendell's influence on me is changing the way I thought about activism. Like, I thought I could be an activist mostly just by writing my novel and letting the novel speak for itself. But when you're from a place like Kentucky and you have even a little bit of a public voice, you have to use it. Because when you're from a place where your representatives don't represent you, the people always turn to the artist, you know? And I mean, you know, to come from a literary tradition that has Wendell Berry, Barbara Kingsolver, Bell Hooks, how can you not speak up, you know, and want to try to change things? And Wendell really helped me, my feet to the fire on that. You know, he told me, he said, just writing about it in novels is enough. You've got to be out there. You've got to be visible. And there's a responsibility on your shoulders, whether you want it or not. Yeah. And he was pretty adamant about that, and I'm thankful to him now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's hard to hear. He's like a father in that way. He tells you the things that are hard to hear, but absolutely true.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank y'all so much for coming out tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I know you're desperate to get your hands on these books now. So if you would just go out the back doors to buy your books. If you already have your books, Silas will be signing. Barbara will not be signing, as we told you. But if you want Silas to sign your book, just line up right here in the center aisle. And thank you all very much for coming, and we'll see you again soon.